Hello! So, yeah, I'm having a bit of a mare here. I've come back from the gym. I thought, oh, I'll settle down with the family. I'll watch Jumanji. But no, my daughter's home and she says, Dad, go make a video. There's an exam tomorrow. And I'm like, really? But what the hell? So I'm going to make this video about the inspector calls first, because that's what most of my viewers are studying. And then I'm going to add in Never Let Me Go, which is what my students are doing in school. So how do we approach this exam, this mega 2¼ hour exam? Well, start with the text that you've studied, and you're going to have to think about the author's purpose. So in an inspector calls, you've got loads of purposes. One, he wants to show, obviously you know this already, the exploitation of the capitalist system and how it exploits the workers. So obviously the Burlings and Gerald represent capitalism, Eva represents the exploited workers, and you can write about that. But we can go further. He's also attacking the patriarchal society, because in this society women are exploited, and that's why Priestley chooses a female, Eva, to be exploited by these characters. And the worst of these characters in terms of how they exploit her sexually are Gerald and Eric. And if you've watched my video on why Eva kills herself with disinfectant to cleanse herself metaphorically on the inside, then you will know that this is the worst thing that has happened to her. That is revealed in the method of her suicide, and this is Priestley trying to show us that the worst culprits here are not Sheila, not Mrs. Burling, not Burling, but Gerald and Eric. Okay, so far so good. We also have the idea of the Christian morality play and the language of Christianity that he uses with "we are all members of one body." That comes straight out of the Anglican service, and Priestley does that because his audience are 95% Christian, and he's cunning. He's using their Christian faith and he's saying, look, this is what Jesus taught you. Well, that's the same as socialism. That's the same as everybody being responsible for someone else. We're all of one body. Get it? If you're a Christian, you have to be a socialist. So that's another purpose. Now, beyond that, he also wants to influence the electorate of 1945. And the people who have had power during the Second World War, who haven't had it before, are women, because they joined the workforce in their millions while the men went off to fight war. Now, when the men came back after the First World War, the same thing had happened, but the women were shoved back into domestic service and married life. And they lost, most of them lost their jobs. Priestley doesn't think that's fair. He doesn't want that to happen again. He thinks that's patriarchal. And so consequently, he wants all the women in his audience to say, do you know what? I think we'll have a different society this time. Let's vote socialist. Let's vote for women having equal rights in the employment area as men. And of course, there is another purpose. Priestley isn't just a socialist. He wants, above all, to stop war. And that's why we get these two deaths of Eva. The first death represents the First World War, and he's suggesting that the capitalist system walked England, Britain, into the First World War because they simply viewed human beings as expendable produce. Yeah, they were just part of business. And so these men were expendable and they went to war. Now, the second death occurs to represent the Second World War, because Priestley is suggesting that the capitalists, again, didn't learn the lessons of the First World War. They still sacrificed not just a generation of children and men, but their own children. So the sons of the wealthy, the sons of the nobility, actually died in greater numbers than the working classes. Why? Well, because they were officers. And the officers were first up over the trenches, and obviously the major target of the enemy. You know, the Germans shot them first. They aimed deliberately for the officers. And so what's going on here is that the ruling classes sacrifice their own children for their own economic gain. So you've got all those purposes. It's easy to write about them, no matter what the question. However, you do get two questions here, and the first one is very likely to be about a character, and the second one is most likely to be about a theme. And I strongly advise you to write about the theme question if you want a grade 6 or higher. You can get even a grade 9 with the character question. I'm just going to explain why it's easier to do it with the theme one. When you're writing about a theme, let's say it's social responsibility, or or whether the inspector is supposed to be supernatural or what have you, these things immediately invite you to start thinking about the author's purpose, and you'll be talking about why Priestley does this. So because you're always writing about Priestley's purpose, you're always in the higher bands. But if you write about a character, something different happens, you start thinking about, well, yeah, this character is a bit like this at the beginning, and then they're a bit like that in the middle, and they're a bit like that in the end, and this is the kind of person they're like. And you forget to write about the author's purpose. Now, the way to get the author's purpose into the character question is to start looking at the character as a construct. When the character is constructed by the author, they're made this way in order to deliver Priestley's message, or the author's message, in order to persuade the reader that, in order to make the reader feel that, in order to make the reader think that. And if you can do that, then you're talking about the author's purpose with the character, you get the higher grades again. Okay, before we get to the poetry, fast forward if you're not doing Never Let Me Go. I've got to do a bit of Never Let Me Go for my students at school, because they'll want to know. Well, exactly the same thing happens. You get a character question probably, and then the theme one. Go for the theme if you can. This is more difficult with Never Let Me Go because it's really difficult to work out what Ishiguro's purpose is. So I'm going to suggest you my interpretation, and no idea whether it's right, but it will help you. Ishiguro wants to show that human beings are just like the clones. So in this dystopian novel, the clones are presented as victims of society. Society controls them through Hailsham, through the school. Society controls them by the kind of work they can have, which is menial, and it controls them through their destiny because they are destined to donate their organs in order to save other people. Now, what Ishiguro is also suggesting, however, is that we in our world are not really any different. We have free will, but we choose not to exercise it. We send all our students to school in which they're taught the same stuff and brainwashed in the same way, just like the students at Hailsham. We tell them they can be whatever they like, but no, they can't. We actually send them all off to university, or we send them all off into jobs, and they get similar jobs to each other, and they have similar ambitions to have a car or a house, or now it's really popular to go travelling. But is it freedom if you end up doing the same thing as everybody else? I don't know. People end up getting married and getting settled down and having mortgages and debts and credit cards, and they're all locked into the same pattern of life. And Ishiguro is asking, actually, are we any different? Are we any different to that? Were the best times when we were actually at school, when we were most free without responsibility? Who knows? Then we look at the relationships that these characters have. And I personally, as a reader, despise all the characters. I'm not interested in them at all. They just don't interest me because they never seem to have any inner life. Well, is Ishiguro arguing that we're the same? We sit down and we watch EastEnders, we watch soaps. We're not really interested in being different to other people and having different ideas. No, we want to talk about the same stuff that we watched on TV or the same holiday we've been on. We're actually all clones of each other. Anyway, it's easy to argue that or against it, depending on your point of view. As long as you're writing about the author's viewpoint, you will always score the marks. Okay, let's get to the poetry. I have a viewer called Emily who loves Ozymandias, so I'm going to give you an Ozymandias comparison. Those of you who've watched my poetry videos will know that I recommend the booze technique. So B is the beginning, the two O's are language features. Don't worry about why I call them beginning with O. Then there's a structure point, form if you can get it. Most poems you can't. With Ozymandias you can. And then there's the ending. That means you only need 5 quotations although you might reasonably say that the structure won't be a quotation. You only need 4 quotations to write about, and the examiner chucks marks at you because they say, hey, here's the first poem free with all the quotations in it, right? So how cool is that? You can ace this exam really easily. The way you will lose marks on this exam is you'll forget to write about the poet's purpose, but the easiest places to do that are at the beginning of the poem and at the end, and by the end of the poem the purpose will have changed slightly, so you can write a more sophisticated response. Okay, then you have to compare it to another poem. Do not do one poem followed by the other poem. Oh no, the examiner will not think that is sophisticated and you won't get into the higher bands. No, instead you write about the beginning of the first poem and then compare that to the beginning of the other, remembering to compare the poet's viewpoints each time. Then you'll write about the language feature of the first poem, comparing it to the language feature of the second poem and saying why that's different or similar. Is it used for the same purpose? Does it control the reader in the same way? You do the same for the next language features, and then you do the same for the structure, and then you do the same for the ending, again coming back to the author's purpose again. Let me demonstrate that with Ozymandias, for example. So, author's purpose at the beginning is to expose the egocentric, narcissistic love of a tyrant ruler, Ozymandias. And he does this by focusing on the statue that's being built at the beginning. Okay, let's contrast that to My Last Duchess, where the Duke is also full of self-love and narcissistic, and we get this from the fact that he's having this famous artist paint his wife and put the painting as a fresco on the wall. He wants to be dominant, and he wants to be remembered forever, similarly with his artworks as Ozymandias did with his statues. Then we've got some language features. Well, there'll be metaphors all the way through, or symbols, and you can talk about how they symbolise the tyrant's power. You can talk about the wrinkled lip or whatever you want. And with the Duke, you can talk about any piece of art that he goes on about, or his attitude to his wife, any language feature, it doesn't matter. You'll always be able to link that to his power-crazed nature. And you can do the same with the next language feature. The structure, really easy to do again. So if we look at Ozymandias, it's a sonnet, which is a love poem. And this is used ironically because Shelley does not love Ozymandias, and he doesn't want the reader to love Ozymandias. He instead uses it to convey Ozymandias' self-love, his narcissism. So it's an ironic use of the sonnet form. Now, similar thing, when we get to My Last Duchess, it's a monologue, which means the Duke refuses anyone else any right of speech. Remember, the Count's representative is there, but he doesn't get a word in. Obviously, he does speak because we hear the Duke answering in his monologue, but we only hear the Duke's words because that represents the Duke's vanity and his tyranny, which, of course, reminds us of Ozymandias. Similarly, it's written in 10-syllable lines, which show his control and obsession. And that's similar to the sonnet form, which is also written in 10-syllable lines and shows the obsession of control that Ozymandias has. So really easy to do. Now, let's get into some sophisticated purposes. So a normal candidate will talk about how the poets want us to react to the characters. Okay, but remember, the characters are constructs. And so why is Shelley writing about this tyrant Ozymandias? Well, he's trying to criticise a whole system of rule, which is through dictatorship, through unelected power. And the reason he's doing that is he's suggesting that in his own country, in Britain, the elected representatives are behaving more like Ozymandias than the democracy that he would want them to have. Democracy is a Greek idea, which is why he calls the poem Ozymandias, a Greek name for the Roman pharaoh Ramesses II. You know, that's who this is really about. It's actually about Ramesses II. And that's why he uses the Greek name, to remind us of the traditions of democracy that he wants in his own country. Well, Browning, about 40 odd years later, is doing the same thing. He takes this aristocrat, this duke, and he shows his full evil sense of power, And he does that to show that his own aristocracy in Britain in the 1840s is also obsessed with its own wealth, is also therefore corrupt, and is also anti-nature and anti-life, and that's represented by the Duchess who he kills. Right, there's another connection obviously between the two poems, which is the way that both poets use the symbolic nature of art and to celebrate how art outlasts these tyrannical men. So we can imagine that the Duke's art that's on the wall and the statue of Neptune that he uses to represent his own godlike power, or his view of his own godlike power, these things will outlast him. And there's an irony in that. Shelley is more obvious about that because he takes the statue and talks about the skill of the sculptor in making the statue, and that's what's left. We remember the skill of the sculptor who's caught the expression of this tyrant, Ozymandias. His work lasts, but Ozymandias dies and is forgotten. And Shelley, of course, is also being doubly ironic here because he's hoping his own poem will become a work of art that is remembered. And perhaps he's asking the question that ultimately, are artists also quite tyrannical? Do they pursue immortality through their work? So, really easy to compare. You don't have to know the poems that well because you only have to write about those 5 things in them, because you've got to compare them. That's 10 things to write about. I mean, that's a lot. Right, what's next? Well, next is the unseen poem, and I'd advise you to do exactly the same. Beginning, 2 language features, structure point, the ending. Remember that the beginning and the ending is where you'll find the author's purposes really clearly, and you won't have to write about loads of those because it's an unseen poem. You're not expected to be able to study it in loads of depth. It's really easy to do. And most students won't be writing about the author's purpose because the question won't ask you probably about the author's purpose. It will say, you know, how does it present the idea of friendship or the idea of loss? But that's code for tell us how they want to influence the reader. Tell us how they want the reader to think in the future or react to these people in their own lives. That's the author's purpose. And it will be most obvious at the ending, okay? So when you get to the end, write about the ending and you'll get much higher marks than other students who are just fannying about writing about anything in the poem. Okay, then you've got the final 8-mark question, which is super easy. You get another short, tiny little unseen poem, and it will have loads of similarities to the one you've just studied, and they're just 3 marks because you'll be asked to compare them in some way, and the similarities will be flipping obvious. You don't have to write loads, that much probably on the final comparison. Do more if you can, right? But it's only 8 marks. You're going to put your effort into the text question, then into the poetry comparison question, and then into the unseen poem. They carry by far the most marks. Right, what else is going to help you get more marks than the person over there and the person over there? You'll remember from my previous videos, it is the fact that they will be wilting. They will be pretending that they're going to die. They will be telling you that their arms are going to drop off because this is a 2.25 hour exam, which is mega. You know, even I might find that slightly difficult. Actually, I'm lying. I'd find it super easy, but what the hell? You're a teenager and I'm a boring old adult and I could write for 10 hours. But forget that. It's only 2.25 hours and you can do it. They will be whinging. They will be pretending that they're working. I'm thinking, sir. But you know they're not. And I'm serious about that, okay? I'm making a joke about it, but I'm serious. The students who keep writing will get grades higher, not just 1 grade, but 2 or 3, because they will just make more points. They will just make more points and get more marks. It's simple logic. So do not stop. Good luck. I'm going to go and watch the rest of Jumanji now. Rock on, Mr. Rock, and well, good luck.